County that they did all right where they live, but there were several trees and all down in Tonga County. Fire department was getting called out quite a bit last night. So, and I saw a shrug from the Hmong, so must have not been around your area. So. Brother Terry has a funeral that he's going to go to this afternoon. It's at 3 o'clock at Alex City. So after morning worship, he's going to be heading up that way and then going to try to be back in time for service tonight. But let's keep him in our prayers, both his health and his travel. And talking to him this morning, Brother Jeremy Quanch fell again last night and banged up his knee pretty good. So he's propped up in bed and feeling a little better than last night. But let's make sure we keep him in our thoughts and prayers also. Didn't get a report on Jesse. Is he coming around or is he still in? Okay, they put his therapy on pause until his knee heals a little better. Thought that might be aggravating it. So, and don't recall exactly what we've told you, but according to some, the therapist and others, the procedure that he had was actually worse than a complete knee replacement. So, as far as the therapy goes, so let's keep that. Matter of fact, we just need to keep the whole Quanch family in our prayers, don't we? And the Fullers talked to Dot, and Glenn is not doing well at all. They're supposed to go back tomorrow for a follow-up, and her words to me was, we know it's not going to be good news, so let's do keep them in our prayers. The Stablers, Doug's feeling some better, still in a little pain. Have I missed? Yes, ma'am. Okay. All right. Sister Rosie's going to be having a few tests done, so let's remember her. Andrea's procedure went well Thursday. Just waiting on some test results on that now, but I think she weathered it a lot better than she thought she would. She had heard some stories from other people that had had similar procedures, and she was anticipating a little bit more pain and aggravation, but she's doing well. So appreciate all the prayers on her behalf. Did we miss anything else? Brother Henderson, would you lead us in a prayer then, please?
Heavenly Father, Almighty God, thank you for another day that you have allowed us to gather, worship you, and learn of your word. Father, we pray for every one of these that were mentioned and those that we do not know of that are sick or injured, that it is your will you restore them to their health. Father, thank you for protecting us from inclement weather and allowing us to come forward and better serve your will in all that we do. We thank you, Father, for this hour we have to learn your word. We love you, Father. Thank you. I pray this prayer to you in the name of our Lord, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Since he had mentioned inclement weather in his prayer there, that just, Brother Jeremy, I have just a small touch of what I know he has a great touch of, and that is every time the weather comes in now, all my bones and joints, and especially the breaks, hurt. And I've talked to him before, and he can predict weather a day or two before I can. So that in addition to a fall is not good. So 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Chapter 5 is only 13 verses long. However, I personally feel like we may not get through this chapter today, because when you sit back and look at it and really digest it, there is a heap of information in this chapter. Paul starts out by saying, and now remember, he's writing to the Corinthians because he had heard in chapter 1, verse 11 from somebody that there was contentions and aggravation going on in Corinth, the Corinthian church. And remember also how we have described Corinth in the first century, how it was Sin City. Anything that could be evil going on would go on. And he's been talking about that and will continue for a while. But in verse 5, he is addressing a particular issue. And he starts out by saying, it is reported commonly. Now, if we just think about that word for a moment, what does commonly mean? Basically, it's everyday news. It's nothing new. It's just something that's always present. In that context, he says, there is fornication among you. Now, when we look at this particular phrasing here, the fornication is going to take on the general scope of the term. It's going to include all forms of sexual immorality, adultery, etc. So, and then when he goes on and he says, and such fornication as is not so much as mentioned among the Gentiles. What would it mean to say that we're not that something is not mentioned? Is it a rare occurrence, or is it something that is so bad that we're not going to even talk about it? You see, Brother Clark. It could be, but in this particular case, I believe it is where on the other end, that it is something that is so bad you don't want to talk about it. The reason I say that is Cicero, who was a Roman, he was a politician, lawyer, known for his oration, how good he was at speaking and all. He called it, and I made a note here to make sure I got it exactly right of what he said. He said, it is an incredible and unheard of wickedness. An incredible and unheard of wickedness. Now, this was a Roman talking about it, and we know that it occurred during Rome. If you just look at all the Caesars and how they acted and all of their incest and intermarriage and killings and all like that, we know that it was one of those things that was commonplace, but yet Cicero was saying that it is a wickedness, that it is just something that you don't do. So if you put his words in context with what Paul is saying here, that it is something, and I feel like that Paul is addressing the Jewish more than the Gentiles here, because he's talking specifically to them and saying, this is so bad that even the Gentiles think it's bad. And then if you go back into the book of Leviticus, what are the instructions that they were given in the book of Leviticus? How to deal with in-laws, parents, and fathers' wives and things like that. They weren't to go into their father's wife because it uncovered the father's nakedness. Now, there's some that when they look at this, they're thinking, well, the man is dead, so the husband is dead, so it's not quite as bad. But if someone would look at chapter 7 in 1 Corinthians, chapter 7 and verse 12, I personally believe that this brings it into context that the father is still alive, or the man's father is still alive. Chapter 7, verse 12, please.
Look at the rest, state that, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away.
Is that chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians?
7:12?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I did it again. 2 Corinthians. There we go. 2 Corinthians. I'm off by a whole book. 2 Corinthians 7:12.
Even though I wrote to you, it is not on account of the one who did the wrong of the injured party, but rather that before God you see for yourselves how devoted to us you are.
All right. The King James says, wherefore, though I wrote unto you, I did not for this cause that had done the wrong, nor for his cause that suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear unto you. Which could take that to be that he was talking to the injured party, and who would the injured party be in this case? It would be the husband or the wife, his father. So personally, I put those two together and think that it is just, you really can't call it incest, I guess, if that was not his mother. If it was his stepmother, but still, you're not, the Old Testament told them they weren't supposed to do that. So that is what I get out of verse 1. Does anybody have anything to add, subtract, or? Right. And same way that some tried to divide it up by it being his alive father or dead father, or whether or not he had already put her away for something else. So they're looking at degrees, but on the whole, it just was not supposed to be done. And verse 2 starts out, and ye are puffed up. What does the phrase puffed up mean? I'm sorry? Proud. And if you're going to try to correct somebody and then they act puffed up, what are they doing? Okay, creating some strife, or, well, you're not going to talk to me that way. I'll show you. So and what Paul is telling them here, again, I think is when he puts it in the second part there, and have not rather mourned, means that they are acting proud of what they have done and boasting about it. So in either case, then, if with him addressing the church, what he is telling them is that here in the church, if you're acting that way, what are the people around you going to think? How are the people around you going to act? How much influence are you having on them? You should be doing it the other way, but by doing it this way, you can put influence on them that, hey, it really doesn't matter. If we bring it down into today's terms, well, I'll just talk about me in my life. When I first went in the military, they would want me to go to the club, and I would say no, and they would say, but it's just. Well, if I had gone to the club with them, what kind of influence was that going to be to someone else who knew that I purported to be a Christian? How are they going to look at that? Well, he can do it, so can I. So he's telling them here that you shouldn't be doing that. You did wrong. That hath not done this deed might be taken away from among you. Now, what he's when he goes into that third part of the second verse, he's saying that anybody that does things like this, you need to remove them from your presence. Do we recall a church, one of the 7 churches in Laodicea, or not, never mind, one of the 7 churches where they allowed Jezebel? What were they told? You shouldn't do this. You're allowing something you shouldn't allow. And I look at it that way. Now, what does it mean by taken away from you? And we're going to go into this a little bit farther. For I verily, as absent in body but present in spirit, have judged already, as though I were present, concerning him that hath so done this deed. There is no mystery here that Paul, even when he was not in Corinth, was still with Corinth. Every time Andrea and I go on vacation, where is our heart on Sundays and Wednesdays? We're thinking about Grandview Pines. And that's what Paul is talking about here. Even though I am not with you in body, I am with you in spirit. Hasn't he already mentioned that he, like the letter to the Romans, he prayed for them, wished he was there, thought about them continually. Same thing here. He's just, I'm not there with you physically, but I still understand what's going on. Yes, sir.
God knows what's taking place or whatever Paul is saying about the situation has to be correct or
Yes, sir. Brother Client said that when Paul heard about this, he could have taken it as gossip, just 2 people not getting along and somebody trying to snitch on somebody. But Paul had that divine inspiration. He was chosen by God. He knew what was going on. And also, with him establishing the church, he knew what the city was like, what the makeup of the church was like, and if you want to take it that far, the propensity for them to do evil, even after they had come out of the pagan world. If someone comes straight from what we would consider the pagan world, or they did, somebody that we have not studied with very long, somebody that had just walked, a stranger walks in that back door and says, I have been reading, I have lived a horrible life, I have been an alcoholic, I've been into drugs, I've been into every evil that you can think of, but I've been reading and studying the Bible, I want to be baptized. What do we think? Well, first off, we would talk to them, and if they answered all the questions properly, and we don't deny them, but what is hanging in the back of our mind? I don't know you that well. How sincere are you? Should we think that? We should think the other, shouldn't we? Shouldn't we be on the let's do all we can to encourage? But yet, because of the background that we know they came from, what is, and I used a big fancy word, what is their likelihood of going back to the old way versus somebody that we have known for many years and have finally converted? Who would be the most likely to go back to the old way? And these folks there had only been a church there for about 4 years. So, absolutely. And Brother Clunch?
No one other than my life, that would be limited to a few years before or whatever. So it is, you're saying, building up the second part of that Great Commission, that after they go away the gospel, we continue to teach them. We don't know everything. We're still learning. We've got no point of knowing enough to obey the gospel. And if we want to repent of sin, but we have to figure out, where all that falls in line.
And it's just like Paul has mentioned to them before, they had started out on milk, and they're still on milk. And there hadn't been anybody to work with them and get them up to the meat or the real food yet. So, verse 4, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when ye are gathered together in my spirit with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we can go back again to Matthew and take a look at that one, but he's just saying basically that wherever they're gathered, he is with them. The Spirit of Christ is with them. Verse 5, to deliver such an one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the days of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now this one looks like a complicated verse, but if we break it down and we use a little common sense, I don't think it's that difficult. In the Old Testament, what was the penalty for someone that committed adultery? Should have been stoned, put to death. We also know from our study of the Old Testament that it didn't happen in all situations. Did David not commit adultery with Bathsheba? What happened to David? He lost his firstborn by her, but he was penalized to a degree, but he wasn't stoned to death. So here's a good place for us to look at something. Even to us today, we should realize that what they're talking about here, in essence, applies to us today. When we get farther down into it, we'll look at kingdoms, but basically there are only two kingdoms. We are in the kingdom, are we not, as Christians? So here on earth, the place called the kingdom is the church. The church is the kingdom. What's going to happen when each individual dies? If they have lived a righteous life, they're going to the heavenly kingdom, but it's all the same kingdom. Now, what is outside this kingdom? How many other kingdoms are there? There's only one, the worldly kingdom. What happens to those in the world when they die? They go to the one ruled by Satan, to hell. So there's only two kingdoms. And as we look at this, when he is saying, deliver him unto Satan, is he talking about literally taking them out and stoning them at this time? If you really look at it, this is an example of excommunication, where they put somebody out for doing wrong. Because what happens, why are we supposed to expel somebody from the church, from the congregation? To preserve the body. When they have done wrong and they will not correct themselves, we are to put them out. Now, how are we to put them out, and why are we to put them out? We're to put them out so that they can learn a lesson and come back. We're not to forget them. But if they're not going to do right, rather than let them contaminate, and we'll get down into more verses here later talking about leaven, a little leaven, one person can corrupt the whole. The same as a little leaven can corrupt the whole. So when we put somebody out of the church for wrongdoing, it's because we've worked with them. It's not the first option. It's basically the last option. We've worked with them. They will not correct themselves. So we separate ourselves from them to try to teach them a lesson and have them come back. And this is what Paul is talking about here as we get further into it. because he is not talking about a physical death. He's talking about get rid of the materialistic side, get rid of the fleshly influences, and come back spiritually. Verse 6 says, your glorying, meaning your boasting, is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? And then verse 7 says, purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So here we're talking about, it's referring to the sacrifice, how back in the old days, they couldn't have leaven present for 7 days. They had to deal with just the pure bread. Have I talked too much, or have I got you confused, or you got questions or answers, Brother Clunch? Yes, sir. Correct. So, and tying it together here about the unleavened bread, it's just like the leaven would permeate and contaminate the whole. They had to get it out of the house. They had to get rid of it. And here in the church, if you have to remove the bad so that you can stay pure, then that's what you need to do. But then as we come down here, it says, therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leavens of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So you need to stay on that. And then when verse 9 and 10 go together, but I'm only going to read one at a time. It says, when I wrote unto you, meaning he's writing, or may have even written a previous letter we don't know about, but he said, I wrote unto you in an epistle, not to company with fornicators. All right? That means that you're to put them out and have absolutely nothing to do with them, correct? But wait a second. That sentence is not a complete sentence. There's a colon there. He then says in verse 10, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. So he is saying, in essence, that you are to put them away and have nothing to do with them in the way of fellowship. But he does not mean that you are to put them away and forget them, which is the same as someone today, that we never give up on somebody. We may pass them by for a little bit because they're not coming around. They might reject you. They might slam a door in your face. But who knows what's going to happen in another 6 months. We're scheduled to go to the apartments in a month or so and knock on doors. Can we count on everybody there being receptive? Can we count on anybody being receptive? If we get a door slammed in our face today, 2 months later, something may have happened in that person's life that now they are thinking about things, and they might be receptive. When I was in some of the schools I've been in, dealing with sales and all, I was taught that it is most unusual if you make a sale before the third attempt with the same person. You have to, I suppose that's why these telemarketers pester us. I get 3 calls a day sometimes from the same one. Hang up on them 3 times a day too. But we need to be persistent. We need not to give up on anybody. But if we bring in the verse that says if they won't be receptive to you, shake the dust off your feet and move on, does that mean you're not supposed to go back to that city later or make an attempt later? No. What you're trying to do is get something that will trigger something so that they will start listening and paying attention. Brother Clunch?
Over a year ago, I took the easy way out, and I told Janice and the boys they could make the decisions about whatever happened in the hospital. The decision was made because there were bad parts in my intestines was purging out. I wasn't going to live with the chill. That it had to be removed, whereas the rest of them was going to be removed too. I appreciate so much the conversation.
Thank you. But at times, it's good to turn those decisions over to somebody else, because I was up there that night that you were in so much pain that I don't think you was thinking straight. So it was good to have somebody that was not in pain, that could think things through logically. But yes, sir. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so, and we got down to verse 10 where he says, yet not altogether. And so here he brings in not just those that were doing evil in a sexual way, but now he's bringing in everybody. So what he's saying is that we need to be not only mindful of one particular thing, but we need to watch everything. And if somebody is doing anything wrong, we need to make sure that we get that corrected. And we don't get it corrected if we fellowship with them, but we get it corrected if we put them away, except our casual, necessary contact with them. And then there's the opportunity to bring them back at a later time. Because verse 11 says, but now I have written unto you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or a covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, with such one know not to eat. Again, in fellowship with that person. If you work around them, they're your next door neighbor, you don't treat them mean, you still treat them decently, but you don't go fishing with them, you don't go hunting with them, you don't go over and eat with them, but you still have contact with them. And when you see an opportunity, then you can try to talk to them and get them back on the right path. If you were to cut off all ties with them and have nothing to do with them, if you said, well, you didn't do right, we can't have any contact with you anymore, how are you ever going to have a chance to get them to realize they're wrong and bring them back? Christians are in the world, but not of the world. Verse 12 and 13 also go together. Verse 12 says, For what have I to do to judge them also that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within? And when we're talking about judgment here, we can get on that great big old bandwagon. How many people have ever told you that the Bible tells you, judge not that you be not judged? If you're telling them that they have done something wrong, or you're trying to correct something, all of a sudden we're judges. Judge not that you be not judged. And here it looks to me like Paul is saying, well, we don't judge those outside the body, but we judge those inside the body. But how do we do that? And everybody that tells us, judge not that you be not judged, they forget an important verse. That, and also, if you will go to John 7 and verse 24, judge with righteous judgment. Judge with righteous judgment. What does that mean? Every one of us in here, there's not a day goes by but what we don't, if you want to use the term judge something. We voice an opinion of something. Most of the time when Andrew and I are watching TV, it's negative judgment. But it tells us to judge righteous judgment. When Christ meets us on our judgment day and looks at us, how is he going to judge us? He only knows righteous. And what is that? By his standard, by the Bible. He's going to judge by that. He's not going to use emotion. He's going to use fact. He's going to use what we have done. So Marshall Keeble had the phrase that he wasn't judging, that he was just being a fruit inspector. What's the difference? If I inspect a piece of fruit and put it to the side to select another piece of fruit, have I not done the same thing? Have I not judged this one to be not worthy, but this one to be what I'm looking for? All he was doing was changing the language to appease people. In essence, he wasn't appeasing people. He was making the statement just to make things appear less blunt. Thank you. Good words. But absolutely. And he is not going to deviate from that standard. So when we judge in the church, we have every right in the world to judge whether things are being done properly or improperly. If we use the correct standard, if we use the Bible as our standard, and we judge a person's action versus the person or the personality, then we're doing righteous judgment. And I learned this when I was in the Air Force, especially after I got up to a rank where I was having to deal with people and counsel people and all like that. I would call somebody in the office to counsel them, and I would be addressing action. I would be addressing issue. But what would the person automatically and always do? They would take it personally. You're picking on me. It wasn't what you did, it's what you don't like me. And I think we see that going on a lot in the world today. Correct.
It's not from the standpoint we're sitting on the judgment seat and judging them. Both here in this case, as far as the church is concerned, these angels, whether it's really in believing in life, then that person who does it, it's automatically seen the difference between them. So we don't have to say you're wrong, this is what you're guilty of. It's just a matter of evidence of what one is doing, whether it's in the church or it's considered far fallen angels. They're right.
Now, it doesn't happen as much today as it did when I was back in my Air Force days. But when I was in that position and having to make sure everything was running right, if I saw somebody that was 40 years old and older, what would I generally catch them doing wrong? Would be alcohol. If they were younger, what would I likely catch them doing? Drugs. Am I profiling? No. I'm using prior knowledge, past experience, to try to figure out, what's going on. Don't know how it is this day in the military, but when I was in back, I retired in 89, so that tells you how far back it was. In the 80s, I could almost guarantee if somebody was walking crooked and they were over 40, it was alcohol. And if they were slurring their words and acting stupid and they were under that age, it could be both, but most likely it was drugs. So we can have, yes, sir? Yes, sir. Right. Brother Terry and I, while Andrea was having some surgery, or procedure, we was talking about candling eggs. How many of you know what that phrase means? 2 or 3 of you, okay. But by looking at something from the outside, you don't know what it is. But when you put a light behind it and can see through it, then you can tell what's going on inside. Verse 13 then said, I saw Luke walk out. So verse 13 says, but them that are without, God judge. Therefore put away from among yourselves that wicked person. So again, in essence, he is not talking about putting them away and forgetting about them. He is just talking about separate yourself from them right now. If the opportunity comes around, do so, but don't let that one bad apple spoil the whole barrel. Don't let that little leaven spoil the whole batch. And ones that are outside the church is not our responsibility, so to speak. God's going to take care of that. Our responsibility is to get people in the church and then make sure they're doing the right things. Brother Golden? Yes, sir. That's it. Matter of fact, and people don't realize just how simple it is because they convolute the word judge. I was in your place of business the other day, and you told me I was getting a prescription for Andrea, and you told me that insurance wasn't going to cover it, and it was kind of expensive. You remember that? And what did I say? Got to have it, fill it. Did I not make a judgment call? Absolutely. Could I have turned it down because I didn't want to afford it? Could have, but would that have done any good for her? No. I really didn't have a choice, but yet you had to know what was going to go on, so I had to make a judgment call and say, got to have it, do it. So every day we make a call one way or the other. We might not think about it because it's not something this serious, but every day we evaluate and we make decisions, which is making judgment. Brother Clunch? And we can see an example of that all the way back in the book of Matthew. What happened to the lady that was caught in adultery and they were ready to stone her? What happened there? He said the one that, and what happened? They all left, and what did he tell the woman? Go and sin no more. Give her a second chance. Same here. We did get finished. Luke's going to ring the bell just any minute now, so I'm not going to try to get into chapter 3. Thank y'all for your attention and your comments.